Hey, in this video I'm going to be walking you guys through changing out all 6 of the fuel injectors on your 3.4 liter Toyota engine. So first off, let me show you all of the parts that I have to replace as we go through this job. Alright, so here are the parts, and it tallied out to about $341 for everything. So to start, we have our fuel injectors, and I got these from Motor West Performance, and that's going to be out in California. So here's their little card and plug for that. And then here are the injectors. Now these are newer injectors, or they're refurbished injectors, but they're not the traditional brown, which is actually what I'm going to be pulling out. But they are Denso fuel injectors. They're all individually wrapped, and they also came with 3 spare injector rings and a little bit of lube to put them on. Besides that, I've got 1 fuel pressure regulator gasket or O-ring, and then I've got 6 fuel injector O-rings here. These are Toyota. Everything is Toyota here. I've got 1 throttle body gasket. I've got 6 aluminum washers, and this is for the fuel rail. Or fuel rails, and then I've got my 2 plenum gaskets. Now note, if you want, you could reuse these gaskets. It's not recommended, and honestly I think they're like $11 a piece, so it was worth it for me. Same with like these aluminum washers. Realize that there's probably 200,000 miles on your vehicle, or at least 20 years on it. So if you're taking it all apart, it is worth it to go ahead and buy these parts so you don't have to go back and take everything apart again. Now to start, I'm going to go ahead and remove the negative battery terminal, so that's just going to take a 10mm box end wrench. Next up, we're going to take off the intake runner here, and it's just 2 tension clamps. There's going to be 1 here, and then there's 1 here, and they're 10mm. You can take out the entire intake if you want, but we're wanting to get here to the throttle body, and this would also be a good time to replace this intake hose right here, and I've got a video on that if yours is starting to break down. Alright, so I have both of my clamps loosened. You can see I already took it off on this end, and then I went ahead and I labeled my vacuum lines. This one goes to the air box, this one goes to the silencer. That's pretty obvious, but just a good habit to label everything and make sure it goes into the right place when you put it back together. And then back here you have another vacuum line running off of this intake tube, but we're just going to slide it off the throttle body and lift it out. Now that we have the intake off, next up is the throttle body, but before we can remove it, we've got our 3 cables here. On this 99 model, we've got the cruise control, trans cape down, and the engine throttle cable, and it requires 2 14mm open ends. I've got 1, and so I'm going to use an adjustable as well. You're going to crack these nuts free here and slide them out of each of their respective brackets. So now they're all cracked free, they're hanging around. You may need to remove it from this little S bracket here to give you some more room, but really all it is you slide it down and around, and then it just slides out. Give it the old shimmy, and it slides on out, and then you can set it to the side, and you just do that for each one of these cables. And it's going to be, again, pretty hard to get them mixed up when going to put them back in. But it's fairly simple. You can label them if you would like. Okay, now we can take off the throttle body. Note that there is 1 vacuum line, so I went ahead and slid that off. Now, it seems as if you can just take the throttle body off and you don't need to disconnect any of the electricals. It's just the 2 12mm nuts and 2 12mm bolts. So those 4 things, and then we should be able to slide it off and just leave it here, since we'll be working on the other side of the engine to get to the fuel injector. So let's go ahead and take it off. And note, here are your 3 coil packs, so if you're wanting to determine if it's a bad coil pack, you can swap these around. You just have your little electrical connection, a 10mm holding it in, and then you've got your spark plug wires that are also attached that you'll have to remove. But let's go ahead and take this throttle body off. I already have the bolts and the nuts off, so it should just be, we gotta wiggle it a little bit here. Okay, so I was able to slide the throttle body off. Note that there are a lot of vacuum lines attached to it, but you were still able to get it off and kind of swing it off to the side with the vacuum lines attached. I did, however, take off 2 electrical connections. There's one down here on the bottom of the throttle body, and then there's one here to the back side that I went ahead and disconnected so there wasn't any excess stress on those electrical wires. Side note, I would recommend doing this job early in the morning, especially if you live in the south, because it's like 11 o'clock and I am already sweating buckets out here. Alright, and then you can take out your throttle body gasket. You can see we've got some a little bit of oil buildup on it, so that's not very good. We'll have to do some investigation as we go deeper into the job. Alright, now we've got some hoses to take off the plenum here, and you've got one right here, and it just slides down. Let's see if we can get it. Alright, so there's that one right there, and then we've got a couple with one of these little like tension clamps, so you might need some pliers to remove them, but you can just kind of slide them on down, and then it should just kind of slide off. Alright, so I popped that one off, but it did in fact tear, and it looks as if it was torn before, and maybe somebody put this like tape type stuff on it. So I'll go ahead and order a new one of those to put on, because it's honestly really stiff and brittle anyway, so it probably needs to be changed out. Next up, we've got our hose here, and again, it's just a little clamp, so you can squeeze it with your pliers, slide it down a little ways, and then gently slide it off like that. Alright, so now we're almost ready to take the upper plenum off. Do note that over here you've got this little bracket, and it houses the throttle cable, and you can just pop that out, and then you're going to have your diagnostic box. Some models won't have it, but it's really easy. There's a little black tab. You pull it towards the middle of the car, and then it just slides. Come on now. Just slides right on off, and you can just hang it off to the side. And now we're ready to take off the bolts and nuts for the plenum. Okay, so now we're ready to take the plenum off, and it's a mixture of 6 bolts and nuts. So we've got one here, we've got a nut here, and then another bolt right here, and then it's symmetrical for the other side. So you'll have another nut right here, or a bolt there, a nut there, and then another bolt back here that matches that one. So let's go ahead and run those off. Okay, so we got all of the bolts and the nuts, including the stud for the front. Come on now, there we go. We got the whole stud that came out, so we're gonna see what we're gonna do about that. But there's one more hose that we gotta take off, and that's this one. So we'll slide it off, and it'll just sit back there. And now the plenum can just be lifted gently, hopefully. Alright, so there was nothing else that was stuck on it. I just had to wiggle it through all of these cables. But here you go, wiggle it out gently. Goodness, I'm getting stuck on everything. And then you can set this off to the side. Okay, and you can take off your old upper plenum gasket. So I'm just going to slide that off. And now be careful, because at this point, anything that falls down into the lower intake, it is possible that it can run down these runners and go straight into the engine, so you need to be very careful. As we take the lower off, we'll put tape over top of the intake so that nothing does actually fall inside the engine. Alright, so here on the back side of the lower plenum, you've got this little hose, and I've already wiggled it pretty much off. And then on the back, you also have a 10mm bolt. Now you're going to want something kind of small to wiggle in there, and you're going to push up against this hose, and you're just going to slowly take it off. Get it to the point where it's, fairly loose, and then I would recommend using your fingers just so you don't lose it, or if you have little magnetic sockets, that's also very beneficial. It'll help you from dropping it. With these smaller bolts, that tends to happen. They like to jump out of your fingers, it seems. Alright, now here we are on the driver's side, and the last 3 bolts on this side are going to be this 12mm bolt here, And then way down, it's kind of hard to see, but it's like a brass colored, yep, there you go, 10 millimeter right there. And that's going to be in between cylinders, or I guess the runner tubes 4 and 5. And then you're going to have one more, let's see if you can see that one, right under cylinder 6. There you go, now you can see it, or the 6th runner there. And that also is a 10 millimeter. Alright, so now with those 3 out, again, 2 10 millimeters and the 1 12 millimeter, we've got 5 more bolts, and they're not too hard to find. You're going to have a nut down in here, so that's 1, and then you're going to have a bolt down in here, 2, 3, that's the 3rd bolt back there, and then you're going to have a nut in the back. Again, it's going to be symmetrical, or pretty much symmetrical with this nut on the back side. I can't really reach around to show you. And then you're going to have one center running bolt right here that is also going to be removed. Now I've seen that it's best to remove that one last, as it kind of pivots off that and it holds itself up that way. So we're going to take these 4 off, and then we're going to worry about that middle one. Alright, now I've got the first 4, or the 2 nuts and the 2 bolts out, and then this is the 5th. Again, it's in the middle, and it kind of supports the plenum a little bit. We're going to go ahead and slide it out. So there it is. That's the long runner. We're just going to set it, well, let's be safe. We'll set it over here. And then gently lift the lower plenum out. Again, realize that you've got a lot of hoses that are hanging around. You might get snagged on, so just go slow. And we should be able to wiggle it on out. Let's see. Okay, it looks like we've got one electrical connection here. So I missed it when I was taking everything off on this side, but you've got one 10 millimeter bolt here, and that grounds the diagnostic box, which is right here. So we're going to go ahead and run that off, and then we should be free to take it all the way out. Alright, so now this is what you were left with. You can see the lower plenum gasket that is in there, or the lower intake gasket, and then right into your intake for your engine. So now we're going to want to put something over top just in case any debris, or goodness, if there was a screw or a nut that fell in there, that would be absolutely terrible. So we're going to put something over it just to cover it up. Now that we have our intake covered up, we can start taking out our fuel injectors, and these are just little pinch tabs. Let me see if I can show it to you. There's just a little piece there on the back side that you squeeze, and it comes off. I do want to note, though, that obviously somebody has been in here before, because normally you'll have a piece of plastic that is going to cover up the engine, or the wiring harness here, and so you can see that this is missing. It would normally look something like this on this side. It's kind of hard to see, and this is not focusing, but that plastic right in there, it's known to be very brittle, so obviously somebody has been in here before, because it's completely missing. The screws that would go in here are also missing, so I don't know if these injectors have been replaced before, or maybe a single injector has been replaced. I'll have to look a little bit closer as I pull them all out. Alright, so now we are taking off the fuel rails, and you're going to have 3 banjo bolts. 2 are going to be on the passenger side, and 1 is going to be on the driver's side. Now these are going to be 17 millimeter bolts located at the ends of the rails, and then they're connected right here. It's not focusing, there we go. But you'll have a banjo bolt here, 1 on that side, and then 1 back here, and you're going to need a open end or boxed end wrench to crack those loose, because it's just too tight to fit a socket, or if you have a ratcheting head wrench, that would also work. And then over here we have the fuel pressure regulator, and you can take this off, but what I'm going to do is come back. I'm going to follow the line back from it, and it goes to right here. Let me see if I can point it out to you guys. Right back here, you've got this little clip, and I'm going to unclip this and slide that off, and that way I won't have to really mess with the fuel pressure regulator there. I can just take this off and run that hose back around, and then when we take these 12mm bolts off for the fuel rail, then it'll just all come off along with that hose. Alright, so now you can see we have this back one taken off, and it's just going to sit there. You can see it has the old washers on it, so we're going to want to pull that bolt out, take those old washers out, and put the new aluminum washers in. And then here we have this bolt out and the little bridge across to the next fuel rail. We have that out. And then as we make our way down, again, here's the fuel pressure regulator, and you follow that line back and it gets to here. I went ahead and pulled the clamp down. You can see it sitting back there, and I'm going to slide that hose off. At this point, we're going to hit these 4 12mm, and these fuel rails will just lift out. Okay, now to get the fuel rail out. We'll see how easy or difficult it is for this. I don't want to break anything, but okay. Alright, well, so we got, let's kind of finagle it out of here. We got the rail, but no injectors. So, let's just start. Okay, so it's a bit difficult to get off, but here it is. And realize that this is going to be full of gas. So if it didn't all drain out of this hose, and note I had a little paper towel there, when you pull it, there's going to be a lot that flows out of the injectors if you can get them out in one go. But realize that there's a lot of gas in here, and then when you take these injectors out, just be careful and you kind of just wiggle them out. And it's pretty simple. But if they don't come out with the rail, you just pull them out, no problemo. And now the passenger side, let's see how well that one comes out. Maybe a little bit easier. Who knows? Oh, alright, so we're not getting the injectors this time either. Maybe. And we're hung up on this one. Man, what in the world is the deal with this? Okay, there we go. So all we got is the rail. So there we go. Okay, so here we are, and I've laid out both of the fuel rails and the injectors with their firing order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is listed out right here on this diagram. And I just want to note something here. These fuel injectors right here, which have a brown tip at the end of them after that little rubber O-ring, those are original, and when you look at the coating on it, the last little numbers are 8LF, and so you can see on the driver's side they're all the same. But when we move over here to the passenger side, I'm not sure how well you can see it, but this one right here has a red O-ring, so that was the first thing to tip me off, but it also has a silver tip on the end, and this one right here has a black O-ring, and again a silver tip on the end. Now the last 3 numbers on this one are 2LL, and this one is 5CB. So that would indicate to me that these, which are also a bit cleaner on the ends in comparison to, say, one like this, have already been replaced at some point, but only those 2, the remaining 4, were left. So that is quite interesting. Now, one thing you can do with your faulty fuel injector is to take it and hook it up to a multimeter with the electrical ends and see if it reads over roughly 12 to 14 ohms. That would indicate that there's an electrical problem with your fuel injector. Otherwise, it may just be clogged up, and you could take it apart and see. You can actually take out all of your fuel injectors and ship them off, and they will clean them and give you all of the flow data when they go to test them, and they will then send them back. So that's one cool thing if you have another vehicle and you can take all these out and then ship them off, and they will give you all the specs after they have been cleaned on out. Now, I just cleaned out each one of the little slots or housings where the fuel injectors go. There was a lot of gunk that was built up in there, and I didn't want it to fall into the engine itself, so I had a little vacuum here and I held it up, and I went at it very lightly with a flathead screwdriver, and it kind of chiseled it away. But here you can see on these older injectors that it was just all built up around that little rubber fitting. And again, you know, that's not something that you want to fall into your engine. So if you can carefully clean it out, I would recommend doing that before putting in the new fuel injectors. Alright, so now we're installing the new fuel injector. So this is the driver's side front of it, and then here's the back. And they recommend that you take your fuel injectors, and oh, there we go, the fuel injector, and you can dip it in a little bit of gasoline. And now if you wiggle it up in there, you risk kind of pinching that O-ring on the tip. So I'm just going to slide this one in and see how well it goes. It's going to be kind of tough since it is a new O-ring. You can shove it in there, and then as you turn them, it should be fairly secure in there. And if there's a lot of resistance, you'll know it kind of folded up on itself. But it's pretty good. This one was the same way. And we can take our last one for the driver's side. Same thing. Good to go. Alright, so now I have the fuel rail, I've got all the new injectors, the electrical connection is pointing outward as it should. I've cleaned out all of our mating surfaces here, and what we're going to do is start with running this hose back behind, just as it came out, and just be gentle as it goes back there. There's a lot back there, and then we're going to drop them down. Now, these are new O-rings. And as I found on those new injectors that were in there, it's very difficult to get them out. So I'm guessing it's going to be just as hard to get them to plop in. So there's probably going to be some resistance. Alright, now that I have it on, I'm going to take my two 12mm bolts for the side and drop them on in. And I'll just kind of snug them down a little bit. Alright, now I went ahead and torqued each of these 12mm down to 120 inch-pounds, or roughly 10 foot-pounds. I'm going to slide this hose back on, and this was for the fuel pressure sensor. So I'm going to slide that back on, and then slide the little clamp over top, and make sure that that is all secure. Alright, so now I've got the passenger side fuel rail in, and I've got all the injectors. I twisted them a little bit to make sure they still had a little bit of movement, and none of the O-rings were all bound up in there. Went ahead and torqued each one of those bolts down to 120 inch-pounds, and I put that back banjo bolt with two new aluminum washers, one on the front side of the fuel line that comes in on the bolt, and then one on the back side of the bolt. Now I'm going to go ahead and attach this front little bridge type connector, and again, here you can kind of see as to how those washers are on there. One is in the front and then one is on the back side. Now you can reuse them if you want. It's recommended not to because they get squished down. I mean, it kind of alters the shape of them a little bit, so it's best just to buy new ones. They're cheap anyway. So we're going to go ahead and now put this on the front. Alright, here it is with the new washers on, and again, it seems as if that passenger side of the vehicle had been tampered with, again, because these washers differ from the original washers that are here on the driver's side. Alright, now I've got the three 17mm banjo bolts for the fuel rail all on. They're supposed to be torqued to 25 foot-pounds. I don't have the tool to fit back there to torque it to 25 foot-pounds, so I use the German torque spec of Gutentite and just yammed on it until I could not tighten it anymore. So hopefully that'll be good. Besides that, I have all of the fuel injectors now connected, and so what we should be able to do now is remove the tape and put the lower plenum back on. Alright, so now we can stick our lower plenum gasket on, and it just slides on the two studs. There's one in the front and one in the back, and it sets on just like that. And now we can go ahead and put the lower plenum onto this gasket. Now that we have the lower plenum back on, you can go ahead and just start dropping in some of the bolts. Note that it is still a little bit wobbly, but I went ahead and I'm just doing it in the reverse order. So the middle one first, and now I'm going to put on the remaining 2 nuts and 2 bolts. Alright, now the lower plenum is on, all the bolts have been torqued to 13 foot-pounds, and just make sure you go and do them evenly. Now we can begin to connect some of these hoses that we took off earlier, and just make sure when you go to put them back, everything is in the right place. So you got one here, and you've got another one back here. Remember that we took this 10mm out right here for the diagnosis box, which is down in here, so we'll have to put that on. So that's one 10mm. We've got 2 10mm for the fuel line, which is in between cylinders 4 and 5, or the pipes for the 4th and 5th intake runner. And then the 6th intake runner has another 10mm underneath it. And then right here we have this hoist point that is a 12mm, and that goes in right there. Okay, so now we've got the lower plenum all good to go. We've got the 10mm in for the diagnosis or diagnostic box that is hanging right here. We've got our vacuum line attached. I'll move this little clamp up here in a second. We've got our 12mm here, the 2 10mm for the fuel line, and then that last little 10mm that goes right back here. Make sure you put that one in as well. Okay, so now we have the gasket on, but if you recall, I had this little situation here. If it focuses in, the stud and nut are combined together. I've tried to go at it with some vice grips and the socket on there. Next up would be to double nut it if I can get it on, but I'm thinking I might be able to use it as just acting as a bolt. The only thing is that it's not going to help to align the upper plenum as I go to drop it on, as the stud acts to hold this gasket in place. So I'm going to line it up and see if the fasteners that still are in their normal condition will help to seat everything together, and see if this will run down and work. Okay, so now I have all of the bolts for the upper plenum in. They're snugged, they're not torqued, but I want to go ahead and line up the throttle body. So I have my new throttle body gasket. Now, earlier I had said something in regards to oil being on the throttle body gasket and on the throttle body itself. Now, I've done a little bit of research, and this can happen over time just due to the PCV, or positive crankcase ventilation, which comes up right in here. That's going to be sucking gaseous fumes out of the crankcase and then circulating it back to get reburned, and there can be oil vapors inside of that, and that's what leads to this oil residue. Now, you can go through with a throttle body cleaner and clean all of this out. I don't have any at the moment, so that'll be something for another time, but it isn't that big of a deal. And also, if you see oil down in your intake, that's not that big of a deal, as long as it's not an absurd amount. But usually, you know, these vehicles with 200, 250,000, even 300,000 miles, you're going to see that down in those intakes. Alright, so now that gasket is on. We'll put the throttle body in. Alright, so now we have each one of these bolts and nuts torqued to 13 foot-pounds, just like we did the lower. and this stud with the nut stuck on it actually torqued to 13 foot-pounds, which is pretty impressive. So I'm going to leave it for now, but I'm going to monitor it just in case. But now I want to go ahead and pay attention to make sure I put all of my hoses back on. Note, this was the ripped one right here, so I'm going to have to order a new one. It's super duper hard. I might be able to pull it over top and just fire it off to see if everything is still good, but I'm going to have a new hose here. Other than that, you just have small ones that you need to pay attention to as you put it all back together. So you've got the one that I took off on the throttle body. You've got a couple that go down here on the lower plenum if you haven't put those back on. And again, I noted, I marked most of mine. That's always good to do when you go. But just make sure as you're putting all these pieces back on that you put back on these vacuum lines. Alright, so now I've got each of the two nuts tightened to 13 foot-pounds just like the plenum, and same with the bolts down on the bottom. Now remember, I undid these electrical connections, so we'll hook those back on. 1, 2. Give it the old pull to make sure it's still on there, and we're pretty much good to go. On this front, this hose has been connected back, and so we are good right there. Now we can do all of our cables, and let's see, we got trans. Here's the power cable, or the throttle cable for that matter, and so we'll kind of swing it into place here. Alright, so now they're all in place, and you can go with your 14 mil and an open end or 2 open ends if that's all you got. This throttle cable, remember, it hooks in back there, and then it hooks through this little S-bit. Trans, same thing, hooking on the bracket. It all kind of lines up as you go, so you can't really get it all too messed up, to be honest with you. Alright, and so once you have them all tightened down, just give it a quick little pull. Make sure they're all connected, everything's good. And now we can move on to the intake runner. And honestly, you could have done the intake runner and then the cruise control cable, as you know, you could have just pulled it off to the side and then put it in. Alright, so now we have the intake runner back in, you can see there. And really all that's left now is to make sure all of our vacuum lines are attached. So here's one here. We've got one that hangs down, clips in right in here. So we'll pop that one in. That slides over. Slides over to the air box. Holy cow, I'm way over. Okay, there we go. And that's got just a little clamp that I can move with my fingers. Maybe. Yep, we're in place there. Clip that in. That's all clipped in. These are all clipped. We've got this here on the intake boot. That's in place. And then I gave it just a quick little move around to see if it was sitting well. And it is. Again, these are just 10mm clamps here. No big deal. And really with that, you're pretty much done, except for going back and double checking, make sure all your vacuum lines are good. I've got this one that's really no good, so I'm going to have to get a new one. But nonetheless, that is pretty much it. Nothing too crazy. Obviously, you're having to take all this off, which is pretty in-depth and detailed, but if you just go slowly, you should be fine. And make sure that you finish the job with no excess parts. Speaking of finishing with extra parts, I actually did, and that's because I over-ordered. These are the fuel injector O-rings that I ordered, and the injectors came with O-rings already on them, and they even sent me 3 extra. So if you need some O-rings, let me know, and I'll hook you up with them. And then this is the fuel pressure regulator O-ring, and I didn't do that either. I could have, I just chose not to. Once I was in there, I just decided not to, but nonetheless, that is why we did not use these. The fuel injectors came with O-rings already installed, and I did not do the pressure regulator, fuel pressure regulator. A couple last things that I missed on were the diagnosis box, putting that back on. and then the PCV valve hose right back here. Those are the last two things. Other than that, I just took off all the tape that I had and dropped it into my skid plate, but now we should be good to go. Holy Toledo. Now we have the upper plenum, and we're just gonna drop that into place. Oh, with the gasket, of course. I am fairly certain everything is connected. Mind you, I've been out here breathing gas fumes all day, so
You might be a little misled.
yeah.
You should see how far. Look at how hard this thing sucks.
Must be the eco-friendly version. What is this? Big old twig. Loving nature.